Hey everyone, good morning. Good morning, good morning. It is good to be back in the saddle. For those of you who don't know, I've been on a little bit of parental leave for a while, spending some integral and much needed and appreciated time with our not so newborn baby anymore. There we go. The one on the left is the more realistic of the two, isn't it? What a stinker. He just called me from his baby cell phone and he says he's watching me right now. So, yes, what a good little worshiper. Before we begin, would you bow your heads and pray with me? Gracious God, I pray that all gathered here in person and online will receive a word from you which they need most in their life. Guide our hearts, guide our minds during this time of teaching, and help us to set aside the things of life that keep us blocked from you. Help us remember that forever and always, Lord, you are our rock and you are our ever-present Redeemer. Amen. So like I said, it's really good to be back, and I am just so glad that y'all have decided to join us for another week of our sermon series called Half-Truths by United Methodist Pastor Adam Hamilton. Last week, Pastor Emily walked us through our first half-truth, and that was everything happens for a reason. It was a great message. If you weren't here or didn't hear it, go back to our Facebook page and go listen to it. It's really good. But in the message, I'll spoil it for you, right? We learned that actually not everything does happen for a reason. And that while God is involved in our every single day life, you and I, we still have this awesome ability and freedom to choose between the things we do, to choose between the good and the bad. So that was last week, and today we're going to take you on a little journey through our next half-truth. But first, there's a story that goes along with it. And it's kind of a joke, really, right? It's one that gets told by pastors all the time. It's kind of old. And so if you've been in church for long enough, you'll know it, right? But here it is. In a city somewhere in the south, a levee breaks. And you know what a levee is? It holds back some water, right? A bunch of water. And a great amount of this water, when the levee breaks, it begins to flood the surrounding area. Tons and tons of water. Now, there's a man in this city, a very faithful man. He goes to church all the time. He gives what he can. He loves God. He trusts in God for protection. This man is an absolute pillar of faith in that community. Well, with the levee broken and the land surrounding his house is by the levee, everything begins to quickly flood, right? The ground gets saturated and the water levels are rising, and it doesn't take just too long for the water to rise to the level of his porch. And as he's standing outside, looking at the rising waters, a man in a little rowboat comes by. And this man in the rowboat sees the man on the porch, the faithful man, and he shouts out to him, "Jump in, I can save you. Can't you see that the waters are rising?" But the faithful man, he replied, "Thank you, no. I'm praying that God's going to save me." So the man in the rowboat, he rows on away. Not much later, the man is perched up on his roof because the water level had risen so high. He was forced out of his house and onto the slippery tiles of his roof. When something stops by, it's a much larger boat. Perhaps it was commandeered by the police or the Coast Guard. Either way, they see the faithful man sitting on the roof and they shout out to him, "Jump in, we can save you. Can't you see that the waters are rising?" But the faithful man responds, No, thank you, no. I'm praying that God is going to save me. I've got great faith. So the much larger boat drives on by. Now, not too much more time has passed when the faithful man is forced now to scramble up his chimney. The water levels had gotten that high. And as he's there clinging to the brick and the mortar of his chimney, a helicopter flies overhead and shines a light down onto the faithful man. And from the chopper, a voice calls through a megaphone, "We're sending down a rope. Grab onto it. We can save you. Can't you see the water levels are rising?" Flummoxed, angry, and just ticked off, the faithful man yells back, "No! I'm a man of God. I'm praying that God will save me." The chopper then reluctantly flies off in the distance, probably to save someone else. Soon, the water levels rise above the man's chimney, and maybe you can guess what happened. He drowns. Well, the faithful man, he goes to heaven because he's a faithful man, and he demands an audience with God. He's so brash. And naturally, the angels, because it's heaven, they'll do what he wants, right? They usher him into the throne room. The faithful man stands before God and says, God, what gives? I had faith in you. I prayed to you. I gave to you. I showed up to church all the time. I helped others, but you didn't help me. You didn't save me, and you let me drown. Why? To this, God replied, you did pray, and I did hear you. And so I sent you a rowboat, and I sent you a large boat, and I sent you a helicopter. What more did you expect? Right? I mean, you've heard that joke before, yeah? Either you have or it just wasn't very funny. Either way, you get the idea, right? The idea behind this little phrase that gets thrown around all the time. It's our half-truth of the week that we've talked about a little bit in our prayers and in our children's message this morning. It's that God helps those who help themselves. You've heard it, it makes sense, and it's in the Bible, isn't it? Isn't it? Maybe. It sounds biblical at least, right? And parts of it are. God helps those who help themselves. It's a half-truth. What is a half-truth? A half-truth is something that, while largely it is untrue in most regards, it also holds this duality where it is true. There are some little bits that we can glean from it that are true. Now, in the Bible, there are so many stories and teachings that stand honestly as the antithesis to this saying, to this phrase, God helps those who help themselves. Because if we're really honest with ourselves, the Bible, and all of its vast knowledge and wisdom and teaching, it shows us just two key components, two very important key components to living a good and holy life. And you know what they are. They are, one, love God, and two, love neighbor. Yes. So God helps those who help themselves when put through this biblical filter or lens, right? It might be understood a little differently. Parts of the book of Leviticus and the book of Ruth, they show us really good examples of just how false this half-truth really is. And so let's put it up on the screen, Leviticus 23:22, and it reads, when you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleaning of your harvest. Leave them for the poor and for the foreigner residing among you. I am the Lord your God. So that lays one thing out for us, but the book of Ruth, chapter 2, verses 5 through 9 says something else. It says, Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, who does that young woman belong to? The overseer replied, she is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters. She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. So Boaz said to Ruth, my daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the women. I've told them not to lay a hand on you, and whenever you're thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled. Now, these are great Old Testament examples for us. And in one verse in Leviticus, it lays out what God's people are to do. And then in the book of Ruth, it shows us God's people actually following through with what they were told to do in Leviticus. Great examples. They show us, right, that maybe it's not so much God helps those who help themselves, but really that God calls us to help those who cannot help themselves. If you don't know anything about the book of Ruth, this might not make sense. So I'm going to give you just a little quick rundown so we can kind of gain some traction here. And if you do know it, that's good. This will be a review for you. In the book of Ruth, there is a famine in the house of bread, Bethlehem. And so a certain family leaves the city, and they go off to a foreign land in search of a better life. And while in that land, the land of Moab, the family's two boys, they get married to two local women. Now, sadly, the two boys and also the father of the family, they end up dying. So it's a really tragic story. But the mother, Naomi, she's left in this foreign land with her 2 new daughters-in-law, when she decides to go back to Bethlehem because she had heard that the famine was over. And one of those daughters, Ruth, pledges her loyalty to Naomi. She's going to stick by her side. Naomi's God will become Ruth's God. She's just there through thick and thin. And back in these days, if you'll remember, that women, they had very little authority, and widows had almost no way of carving out a life for themselves without at least the charity of others. And even then, it would not have been good. So they almost literally could not help themselves get out of their situation. So, being the younger, more able-bodied person, Ruth, whom the book is named after, takes advantage of the thing that we read in Leviticus about gleaning from the fields of others. That's how they were going to survive, off the charity of others. And she gleans in Boaz's field, and then, one thing leads to another, and they end up getting married. Happily ever after, yay. And the result of all of this is that, Ruth and Naomi, they don't starve. They have a good life, thanks to Boaz being a faithful man who believed that, helping people was what they needed, and they couldn't help themselves. That's what the book of Ruth is about in a nutshell. So if we look at our half-truth, right, God helps those who help themselves, and we kind of mold it a bit to look more honestly biblical, we get what the book of Ruth is giving. If you go back and read the book of Ruth and you think about God helps those who help themselves, think about it. You'll see what I'm talking about. But by admitting, that this phrase is a half-truth, we also have to admit that while it's not perfect, right, it does hold some water. The duality is it's false and it's true. And there are some biblical instances that might even, back up this saying. And so I think about the Apostle Paul. And in his writings to the early Christians of Thessalonica, you see, he was writing to them because they had taken his message of trusting in Jesus and awaiting Jesus' return, and what they did was they ran with it. What they did was use it as an excuse to stop working entirely. They used it as an excuse to stop providing for themselves and providing for other people because they thought Jesus' return was imminent. It would happen in a few days. They knew it. They knew that if they were faithful, God would just supply their every need until then because of their faith. And it's a lot like the faithful man who refused rescue and drowned in the flood just above his chimney. Right? Sometimes faith isn't enough. It takes a little bit of work as well. What Paul eventually told this congregation in Thessalonica was that those who don't work shouldn't eat. And in my mind, that sounds an awful lot like God helps those who help themselves, doesn't it, right? But Pastor Adam Hamilton says that Benedictine monks use this Latin phrase that I'll probably butcher, and the phrase is ora et labora. Ora et labora. It means pray and work. And that was Paul's message to the Thessalonians. He didn't teach that trusting in Jesus meant you prayed and God magically supplied all the needs. Right? What he taught them was that we are to learn from their mistakes. What he taught them was that he taught them you need to work and pray, essentially. You move your actions through your faith and your prayer. The two go hand in hand. And so in a way, this half-truth is sounding more and more like a whole truth, isn't it? But not so fast, because we know that people have this tendency to take something good and to just run with it. And what we do is we actually run it into the ground, because we have this need to want to see everything as black and white, don't we? That's just the human nature. It's our suffering. Things are good or bad, that's it. There's no gray in between, but the reality is that gray is everywhere. And so what happens a lot of times is we'll take this seemingly pretty decent phrase and we'll just make it into what we want. So God helps those who help themselves looks differently to me than it does to you and you and you, right? Sometimes when we think of this, we might think God helps those who help themselves. It's every man, woman, and child for themselves. And it's sad, but that's typically, a very American mindset. Another word or phrase that you might know is picking yourself up by your bootstraps. We know it's originally a saying that meant to show the absurdity of something because you cannot pick yourself up by your bootstraps. But it's become this mantra for so many, especially in the church, hate to say it, who would rather shirk their God-given duties to help those who cannot help themselves. And while there are absolutely, don't get me wrong, absolutely many circumstances where someone is just being lazy and they're wanting a handout, we as people who say we follow Jesus Christ cannot fall into this trap. The trap is we lump everyone into the same category, into the same pool. Why can't we fall into this trap? Because when we do that, it's too enticing to write everyone off as freeloaders. Everyone is looking to take advantage of me and my charity. So often we use this half-truth to avoid God's obligation on our lives to love our neighbor. Hamilton says people who think they're Christian and yet have no compassion for those in need and who do little to care for them, believing truly that God only helps those who help themselves, have missed an essential component of the gospel. And that's harsh. That's tough to hear for a congregation because we don't come here to feel convicted, do we? I know sometimes I come to church and I want to feel good and uplifted. I don't want somebody saying to me, look at your life and examine what you're doing. How are you not living out what Jesus preached, what Jesus taught and lived? And so we come to church and we want something different, but we have to examine our inner self and say, is that us? Is that us? Are we missing an essential component of the gospel? Are the parties that guide our thoughts and lives, are the things that we bind ourselves to so often, are they missing an essential component to the gospel? I want you to go back with me to the book of Ruth. What if Boaz, that faithful man, had found this young woman gleaning in his fields? What if he came out and he looked down at her and he said, God helps those who help themselves. And he kicked her off his land. Had he not been a faithful man, the misfortunes of Ruth and Naomi might have caused him maybe some hurt, some pause. He felt bad, but God helps those who help themselves. But at the end of the day, having someone on his land taking the leftovers of his crop, well, that would mean less for him, wouldn't it? That would mean he's not getting everything that is owed to him. He owned the land. He made sure the soil was worked and the crops grew. Why should someone else prosper from his hard work? After all, these were just lazy people who needed to do more to help themselves, pick themselves up by their bootstraps, if you will. And if it had happened like that, there might be no gospel. There might be no Jesus. Because Ruth, a foreign woman from the land of Moab, the Bible tells us, was a direct ancestor of Jesus. So honestly, thank God that Boaz didn't believe like so many of us do today. Think about this. What if the person that we write off as being lazy and needing a handout might one day go on to do great things? What if we're in that position ourselves one day? I know that I'd want others to show that kind of kindness, that kind of grace that Boaz showed to Ruth. I'd want that shown to me. I believe we all feel that way. And it's the same kindness and grace that God extends to us every day of our lives. So why don't we give that back? There are times when we can help ourselves, and we should. It's the truth that God is counting on us to do the best we can, to ora et labora, to pray and to work. There are times when people just honestly can't make it on their own. And in those times, God calls us to help. In those times, God calls us to become God's hands, God's feet in the world. We become God's answer to someone else's prayer, God's instrument of grace in their life. At the closing of this chapter of this book, Half-Truths, Adam Hamilton offers up these words that I want to read to you. He says, you will find, if you haven't already, that a time will come when you cannot help yourself. There are things from which you simply cannot save yourself no matter how hard you try. You will not have the strength. You will not have the resources. You will not have the knowledge. And there may be times when you don't believe that you deserve help because you know that you, yourself, are responsible for the difficult situation in which you find yourself in. In those moments, we cry out to God, the only one who can help us. And despite the fact that we are poor and pitiable, weak and afraid, and that we have made a mess of things, God reaches out. God picks us up and makes us clean. God says, I love you, and I will not abandon you. Put your trust in me. Together, we can make this right. And that is grace. That is grace. So thanks be to a God who helps those who work and pray. And even more so, thanks be to a God who helps those, like all of us sometimes, who cannot help themselves.